Now, I'm not saying that I have a solution to the problem, but I have created a slightly alternate model to show you a couple examples of minor alterations to fundamental assumptions, which could possibly lead to extreme changes in the overall picture of the face of the Earth using the same relative distances between known points. I totally believe that accurately mapping the face of the world is completely possible to achieve, but only if we free ourselves of all of these assumptions and allow for a fresh look at the entire process involved with mapping the world. So, to give you an illustration of what I mean, look at this flat Earth map, which I just sort of drew up as an example. It's not intended to be entirely accurate, but instead just a rough illustration of the point that I'm trying to make. So the first major difference you'll notice is that the North Pole, or the 90-degree latitude north, is not a single point, but is instead a ring. This is one fundamental difference that could change the overall face of the Earth drastically in terms of mapping it. The other thing you'll notice is that the path of the sun is not perfectly circular, but instead is elliptical. So I could have drawn this perfectly circular, but instead I chose elliptical to illustrate a point. And of course, I could have moved this or could move this ellipsis laterally in any direction to cause a totally different face of the Earth. All of this being based on when is it day and when is it night, when is it high noon and when is it midnight. So those are sort of the points that we use to make our maps, and what we can see in the sky is sort of a misguided way to judge or to measure the ground. Again, mariners have used the sun and the stars to accurately navigate throughout history, even during Columbus's time. Remember, Columbus had maps that worked, yet an entire set of continents was completely missing from the entire model. So the point here is that it is entirely possible to have working maps that do not accurately represent the face of the Earth in terms of relative sizes and distances between continents. If you don't take anything else away from this video, I hope you take that. That goes for the azimuthal equidistant map as well. Not to get sidetracked, but the AE map is also skewed increasingly, but instead of being, like the equator is most correct, the most correct portion of any equidistant or the azimuthal equidistant map is the very center of it, getting less and less correct the further you get from the center. So, okay, the point here is that we assume that since it's 12 noon at point A while it's midnight at point B, and vice versa, then we must somehow conclude that point A and point B are on opposite sides of the North Pole. That assumption is made in the map that I've created for this exercise in critical thought. However, I figured it was adequate to mention this and just to leave it unchanged and only changing the two details of this hypothetical model I mentioned for the reason of impressing upon the viewer that we certainly need to be rid, or we can certainly consider this by being rid of lots of different sorts of assumptions going into the map making process. Again, I'm no cartographer, but I'm certain that one will eventually stumble on this topic and try to map the plane. I'm also pretty well certain that there's something we're missing, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Another possible way to change the matrix of the map and see how it affects the results would be to move all of the ellipses off center to some degree or another, which would also change the entire matrix, and we'd have a different result, which would technically work if the correct sizes and distances between the continents were represented, which I'm sure is not the case with the continents pasted onto this example. Again, I've taken globe Earth continents and placed them in the approximate positions to where they would appear on such a map. However, I did not take the time to redraw each continent based on coordinates of known places. One thing is for certain, there's no surefire way to take a snapshot of the entire face of the plane. If we assume that the images we get from the International Space Station are at least geographically accurate, which is giving NASA a lot of credit for argument's sake, but assuming that the field of view aboard the footage from the ISS would be similar to what we see at around 300 miles in altitude actually, then even from that great vantage point, you can barely see a bit of the face of the Earth, and you can only make out a little bit of coastline once in a while, never enough to discernibly make out any landmark coastlines of note to really understand what you're looking at on a map, that's for sure. Another item that is critically important that I'll review really quick from Zetetic involves the line of sight to Polaris. This has been argued a bit lately, and I just thought it was important to revisit this point as it is very important, and it just so happened to be in the very same section as the other clip that I rolled, so it's just me being lazy and adding content. Let N represent the North Pole, EE the equator, CC the Tropic of Capricorn, and P the polar star. It will be evident that the line of sight CD, being a tangent to the Earth beyond the equator E, must diverge from the axis N and could not by any known possibility cause the star P to be visible to an observer at C. No matter how distant the star P, the line CD being divergent from the direction NP could never come in contact with it. The fact then that the polar star has often been seen from many degrees beyond the equator is really an important argument against the doctrine of the Earth's rotundity. If you can imagine in the heliocentric model that the stars overhead during summertime are supposedly on the opposite end of the universe during the winter, the simple disproof of the heliocentrism lies in the fact that we can indeed see many of the same constellations from winter to summer. Rowbotham's description of our line of sight on a hypothetical globe being a tangent to the curve is absolutely true and an excellent way to put it. So this means there's a certain point at your horizon line where you simply cannot see beneath the horizon to observe the stars, right? Okay, so on the flat Earth model, if this is simply the natural operation of perspective. Of course, however, if we're humoring the globe, then your line of sight towards the heavens is limited by the ground and the curve of the Earth. I just wanted to highlight this point from Zetetic as it's a fundamental principle of the Jeranism effect, as well as the Morgile effect, which are respectively the first point being we can see many of the same stars from winter to summer, spring to autumn, which any constellation above your head in one season would be on the opposite end of the visible space or the opposite end of the universe during the opposite season. And of course, the Morgile effect being the moon making its circuit around the Earth should only be visible during the day for half of each month. You should have 15 days or so of each month where the moon is only visible during the day. So, if we're on a spinning globe, then the sector of visible space overhead during the winter months would indeed be on the opposite end of the universe for the summer, and so we know for sure that the heliocentric model is incorrect. There are some tweaks that need to be made to the flat Earth model or the flat Earth map, of course. However, I wouldn't necessarily call every one of the flat earthers liars, because it appears that the southernmost region, known as Antarctica, is hiding a key piece of this puzzle, and I believe that that is the reason for the Antarctic Treaty. I've often wondered if there are certain southern areas which might be vast seas, which drift far beyond the path of the sun, but that's probably a topic for another video. Hopefully I've helped some of you understand the issues we have with all maps, both in the globe Earth and the flat Earth maps, and I hope that you now understand why it's so frustrating to have ancient cartographers designing the matrix of our reality. Again, I think there's something we're missing which could involve some of the variables I've mentioned in this video, or maybe something completely different that we haven't thought of, but maybe something very simple. Usually it tends to be. It's important to remember that the behavior of observable celestial bodies is a clever way to manage one's reckoning upon the seas. However, the celestial bodies do not necessarily dictate or represent the actual face of the Earth as a whole. I believe if we had the ability to image the entire face of the Earth, it would look like a foreign image, unlike most of our maps, or totally different than any of our maps. I think that's probably going to be the case. The problem is this plane is so very vast, it's impossible for us, being so tiny in comparison, to get a good look at the entire thing. Since the horizon continues to raise with the observer for all known altitude records, sans that of anything involved with NASA, since they are obviously completely full of it, but for all we know, the expanse of the plane could stretch out to infinity, and the path of the sun itself is the only boundary to our world. So it's just an imaginary boundary, much like the latitude and longitude lines are imaginary lines. There could be ice all around us, like in the Rowbotham model. There could be a combination of that and vast, endless seas in some other direction south. I've never personally been beyond the South Pole. I've actually never left the United States, but I've never been beyond the South Pole, that's for sure, as Admiral Byrd allegedly has. But I personally don't need to in order to know for certain that the Earth isn't a spinning sphere. I'm fully aware that the world is a stationary plane, and it's comforting to know that the spot that you're standing on now has never moved even a single yard. Ever. So I hope this has been informative, if not a revisit on some very important points that were brought up even by Robotham, even in zetetic astronomy from the 1860s, confirming the idea that a flight from Chile to Australia is certainly doable, even in the model which Robotham had originally described so very nicely in zetetic astronomy. The key distances from the three southern ports is so critically important to this argument, as the latitude lines south of the equator should not allow for such distances on a globe with the given proportions. The fact that Polaris has been documented as visible from as far south as the Tropic of Capricorn is an important point that needs to be considered. To end this once and for all, we should do away with the Antarctic Treaty, which would allow for corporate activity, at least in the southernmost regions. Um, if nothing else, this would provide a source of energy and resources, which we don't necessarily need. I mean, we've got alternatives for free energy, but of course they're going to drill and dig for, quote, fossil fuels, which aren't made out of fossils, by the way. But at any rate, it would provide a source of resources for the world and a place for these corporations to go dig that's not in our backyards for a good long while, well away from any sort of civilization or wildlife or rainforests, etc., etc. I'm fairly certain that select corporations are probably already there in the Antarctic, globe or flat, but I've set up a petition to abolish the Arctic and Antarctic treaties all the same, if for no other reason than to get these godforsaken corporations out of our backyards, fracking and strip mining the mountains, drilling and spilling oil all the time. The Antarctic would be the perfect place for that, since you're bound to bother exactly nobody, even if you totally screw the pooch like they do every few years, but especially like they did a few years back in the Gulf of Mexico, if you remember that debacle. At any rate, you can sign the petition anonymously, even if you're not a flat earther. It's really for everyone because the world belongs to all of us, not just the government. We've all taken this defeatist attitude as if the government owns everything, along with their incestual corporate brotherhood, but it's supposed to be the other way around. A lot of people don't realize this, but institutionally, the government and corporations were originally designed with one major commonality. Both the U.S. government and the idea of a corporation were both set up to benefit the commonwealth of the people in general to varying degrees of service. In terms of the government, the Constitutional Republic of America, it was designed to ultimately provide a service to free and independent people, which we obviously are not. And in terms of the corporations, they were originally set up as a sort of public trust created to fulfill some public goal or another, be it build a bridge or a water tower or whatever the case is. Corporations were never intended to make the CEO and the shareholders disgustingly rich, while the average wage for employees of most corporations is dropping when compared to inflation. This was never the idea. But prices are indeed getting higher while your dollar is getting worth less and less. But in most situations, the average person doesn't get a raise, let alone full time hours in many cases. And so the wages remaining stagnant while inflation increases, that means technically our wages are dropping. But I sort of digressed. But my point was that the governments from the 1950s are no longer in control of this world, and indeed most of the people who signed the Antarctic Treaty in the first place aren't even alive anymore. It's high time we open up this topic for discussion, and we open up the Antarctic for the public good. Ball or plain, if we could actually make enough noise to get real attention on the Antarctic Treaty, it would ultimately create a ton of jobs overnight, as well as allow for exploration of an otherwise uncharted landmass here on Earth, flat or round. There are areas in the jungles of South America, in the southern hemisphere, obviously, that are home to numerous ancient sites, often attributed to the Mayan civilization, but they remain untouched. I believe this is owing to the sheer vastness of areas south of the equator, or areas in the southern hemisphere, which have been misrepresented, I believe, on all known maps. I'm sure that we'll eventually get this sort of question ultimately solved, but at this point I'm so tired of worrying about the exact map as if it's so important Earth drastically in terms of mapping it. The other thing you'll notice is that the path of the sun is not perfectly circular, but instead is elliptical. So I could have drawn this perfectly circular, but instead I chose elliptical to illustrate a point. And of course, I could have moved this or could move this ellipsis laterally in any direction to cause a totally different. Now, I'm not saying that I have a solution to the problem, but I have created a slightly alternate model to show you a couple examples of minor alterations to fundamental assumptions, which could possibly lead to extreme changes in the overall picture of the face of the Earth using the same relative distances between known points. Face of the Earth. All of this being based on when is it day and when is it night, when is it high noon and when is it midnight. So those are sort of the points that we use to make our maps, and what we can see in the sky is sort of a misguided way to judge or to measure. As an example, it's not intended to be entirely accurate, but instead just a rough illustration of the point that I'm trying to make. So the first major difference you'll notice is that the North Pole, or the 90-degree latitude north, is not a single point, but is instead a ring. This is one fundamental difference that could change the overall face of the. I totally believe that accurately mapping the face of the world is completely possible to achieve, but only if we free ourselves of all of these assumptions and allow for a fresh look at the entire process involved with mapping the world. So to give you an illustration of what I mean, look at this flat Earth map, which I just sort of drew up